The night was dark, and the only sound was the distant howling of the wind. Inside the castle, the Countess of Salisbury, a woman of rare beauty, lay in her bedchamber, her mind adrift in the quiet of the night. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. Her heart raced as the door to her chamber was pushed open, and in walked the King Edward III, his face twisted with a mix of desire and determination. The Countess Alice tried to speak, but her words were muffled as the King quickly gagged her mouth, silencing her cries. The room was tense with fear and the cold air of betrayal. Edward, a man known for his chivalry and power, had crossed a line that night, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This shocking event was just one chapter in the tumultuous reign of Edward III, a king who, despite his many victories and the respect he earned, was not without his flaws. The incident with the Countess of Salisbury was a dark secret, one that few dared to speak of, and even fewer believed could be true of such a renowned king. But the story begins much earlier, in the halls of power where kings and parliaments clashed, and where the fate of nations was decided. Edward III, a young and ambitious king, had already faced a significant challenge from his own parliament. They had declared him in the wrong, a decision that could have shattered his rule. But Edward, with a combination of humility and strategic thinking, managed to turn the tide in his favor. He admitted his mistakes, forgave those who had opposed him, and used these acts to regain the loyalty of his people. One of his most significant acts of forgiveness was the restoration of the Archbishop, who later served as a key advisor and even as head of the Council of Regency. Another was the appointment of de la Beche to the household of the young Prince Edward, and later as Seneschal of Aquitaine. These acts of mercy and compromise helped Edward reassert his power and authority as king. However, the peace was short-lived. Edward was constantly wary of threats from abroad, especially from France. In 1341, news reached him that King Philip of France was secretly planning an invasion. This, combined with a letter from Ludwig of Bavaria stripping Edward of his imperial title, made the king even more cautious. He sent an embassy to a peace conference at Antoing near Tournai to negotiate a truce. The truce was extended until June 1342, much to the frustration of the Scots, who were eager to continue their own war efforts. The Scots, known for their guerrilla tactics, continued to raid and pillage, but their efforts often lacked the coordination needed to make a significant impact. In April 1341, Sir William Douglas planned a daring raid on Edinburgh Castle. He and his men, disguised as English traders, managed to infiltrate the castle and capture it, a victory that boosted Scottish morale and brought their king, David II, back from France. David II, inexperienced in command, led his forces into a disastrous siege of Newcastle. The Scots were defeated, and the Earl of Moray was captured. Edward III, hearing of the incursion, acted swiftly. He appointed the Earl of Derby to command the English forces, but it was Edward himself who rushed to Newcastle, covering the distance in record time. The Scots, however, withdrew before a decisive battle could be fought, and Edward's campaign ended with little more than a truce. Yet the most shocking event of this period was the alleged rape of the Countess of Salisbury. According to the Chronicle of Jean Labelle, Edward III, during a visit to the Countess's castle, acted on his infatuation with her, leading to a night of violence and betrayal. The Countess, deeply traumatized, later told her husband, the Earl of Salisbury, who was so enraged that he left England to fight the Moors, never to return. This story, whether true or not, casts a long shadow over Edward III's reign. It serves as a reminder that even the most powerful men can be driven by their darkest desires, and that the consequences of such actions can be devastating. The king's reputation, once untarnished, was now marred by the whispers of a terrible deed, a deed that would be remembered and debated for centuries to come. In the world of medieval chronicles, the story of King Edward III and the supposed rape of the Countess of Salisbury is a tangled web of truth and fiction. The details of this story, as told by chroniclers like Jean Labelle and Froissart, reveal a mix of accurate historical events and misleading or outright false information. Let's unravel this story and understand what really happened. First, let's consider the historical context. In 1342, King Edward III was a powerful and influential figure in England. He was known for his military prowess and his efforts to expand his kingdom's influence. One of the key events of that year was a Scottish incursion into Northumberland. Edward's army was likely near Wark Castle, a strategic location on the River Tweed. The castle belonged to the Earl of Salisbury, who was at the time in captivity in France. Wark Castle was a significant fortress, and it's possible that Edward and his men stayed nearby. Edward was a man who enjoyed tournaments and jousting. In 1342, there were several tournaments across England, including one at Dunstable in February, another at Northampton in April, and a third at Eltham in May. These events were a display of chivalry and a way for the king to show his favor to his nobles. In August, there was a great feast at the Tower of London, where Prince Lionel was married. Although there's no direct record of a tournament during this feast, it's likely that jousting was part of the celebration. Now, let's look at the story of the Countess of Salisbury. According to Labelle, the Countess was named Alice, and she was staying at Wark Castle while her husband was away. The story suggests that Edward became infatuated with her, and in a moment of passion raped her. However, this version of events is riddled with inaccuracies. The real Countess was named Catherine, not Alice, and she had been married to the Earl of Salisbury for at least 13 years. It's highly unlikely that Edward had not seen her in all that time, given their close relationship. Additionally, there is no evidence of a nephew named William Montagu, and the Earl of Salisbury did have an heir. One attempt to make the story fit was made by Michael Packey, a 20th century biographer. He suggested that the governor of Wark Castle was Edward Montagu, and his wife was Alice, who was also a cousin of the king. Alice had been betrothed to William Montagu, the Earl of Salisbury's nephew, before her marriage to Edward Montagu. Pack's theory is that Edward Montagu left his wife and nephew at Wark during a period of hostility, which is highly unlikely given the dangerous conditions. The problems with the story are numerous. It's difficult to believe that a high-status lady would habitually stay at a border fortress during a time of conflict, especially without her husband. Moreover, there is no support for this story in English or Scottish chronicles. The inaccuracies in the family details and the lack of corroborating evidence make it hard to accept the story as true. When we examine the three main elements of the story, Edward's visit to Wark, the tournament at London, and the alleged rape, we see that they are separate events that somehow became entangled. The only way the story of the infatuation could be considered credible is if the names and relationships were distorted to fit the other events. The chronicles, particularly Labelle's, were written after 1352, and by that time there were likely other stories about Edward circulating, such as the founding of the Order of the Garter. The real Countess of Salisbury, Catherine, was probably not at Wark Castle during the conflict. If there was a woman named Alice at the castle, she was more likely the wife of the castellan, possibly Sir Edward Montagu. The Earl of Salisbury, who was Edward's best friend, did not have a strained relationship with the king after his return from France. In fact, he went on to serve Edward as a royal plenipotentiary in 1343, which suggests that any supposed infidelity did not affect their relationship. The story of the rape, therefore, is likely a piece of propaganda designed to portray Edward III in a negative light. The chroniclers who wrote about it, including Labelle and Froissart, were influenced by the rumors and stories circulating on the continent. Edward's reputation for enjoying the company of women, while not necessarily promiscuous, could have fueled these rumors. The tournament at Dunstable and the alleged infatuation with a noblewoman at Wark were real events, but the rape story was likely an invention to tarnish Edward's image. In 1342, there were other significant events that are often overshadowed by the scandalous story. One was the conflict over the Irish exchequer. Edward tried to increase his revenues from Ireland by revoking grants made since the death of Edward I. This led to a dispute with the Irish and Anglo-Irish nobility, who met in Parliament and petitioned the king. Edward eventually backed down, realizing the limits of his power in Ireland. The other major event was the tournament at Dunstable in February 1342, which was one of the largest Edward ever held. The tournament celebrated the betrothal of his son Lionel to Elizabeth de Burgh, the heiress of the earldom of Ulster. Edward himself fought as a simple knight, and the event was a grand display of chivalry and royal favor. The king's use of a personal motto, "It is as it is," on his bed and other items of the tournament suggests a deeper significance to the event, possibly reflecting his personal philosophy or the political climate of the time. In the end, while the story of the Countess of Salisbury is a fascinating example of medieval rumor and propaganda, it is important to separate fact from fiction. Edward III's real legacy is one of a strong and effective king, not a man defined by scandal. The truth lies in the historical records and the context of the times, rather than in the sensational stories that have been passed down. In the middle of the 14th century, a tournament in England caused quite a stir. King Edward III organized it, but the exact reason behind it was a mystery. Adam Muirmouth, a chronicler who wrote about the event, thought it was to celebrate a truce with Scotland, but that didn't make sense. Truces with Scotland were common, and Edward never celebrated them on such a grand scale, especially not so far from the Scottish border. The tournament required a lot of preparation. Edward's tailor was paid for making all sorts of fancy clothes, like robes, tunics, and surcoats, for the king and his nobles. Many of these clothes had the phrase, "It is as it is," embroidered on them. Some even had the arms of a legendary knight, Sir Lionel, just like in a tournament from 1334. What did "it is as it is" mean? One historian thought it was a fatalistic message, like, things are as they are and can't be changed. Maybe Edward was feeling resigned about his recent Scottish campaign, or a brief fling he had at war. But it's hard to believe that all the nobles of England would gather just for that. Another idea is that it was about Edward's claim to the French throne. "It is as it is" could mean that Edward's lineage from Philip the Fair was unchangeable. But if that were true, why wait 4 years after claiming the title? And why hold the tournament in England, not France, and in the middle of winter? A different interpretation is more likely. "It is as it is" could be a celebration, not a resignation. If you put the emphasis on the first "is," it becomes "it is as it is," meaning things have come to be as they should be. This makes sense because Edward ordered 12 huge red banners, each over 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, all embroidered with the phrase. These banners were very expensive, costing almost £30, which was a lot of money back then. Edward wanted everyone to see the message, and for those who understood it, it must have been important. One theory is that "it is as it is" announced the death of Edward's father, Edward II. For years, there were rumors that Edward II had survived his supposed execution at Berkeley Castle. In May 1343, Edward finally gave his son, Edward of Woodstock, the title of Prince of Wales, which his father had never given up. This suggests that Edward II had died by then. Edward also made his first pilgrimage to his father's tomb in Gloucester in March 1343, after a near-death experience, indicating that his father had probably been buried by then. There was also an irregularity in a Nottinghamshire chantry ordinance that was finally resolved in January 1343, hinting that Edward II had died by 1342 at the latest. Given that Edward II was likely still alive in 1339 and probably died between 1341 and 1342, it's possible that the "it is as it is" message in February 1342 was about the news of his father's death. Edward had been living with the secret of his father's survival for 14 years, and he had managed to keep it hidden while dealing with all sorts of political and military challenges. Now that his father was dead, Edward could be more aggressive without the fear of his secret being used against him. He could finally be himself like never before. In October 1342, Edward set sail from Sandwich to Brittany. The journey was challenging, with gales and rough seas, but the captains stayed close to the coast to stay on course. They finally reached Brittany on October 23rd, and Edward's choice of Brittany was strategic. Brittany was a semi-autonomous part of France, and if Edward could control it, he would have a foothold in Philip's kingdom and a way to protect his shipping lanes to Gascony. The death of the Duke of Brittany in May 1341 created a power vacuum. The late Duke's half-brother, John de Montfort, and his niece, Jean, both claimed the title. John de Montfort took control of Nantes and other castles, but Charles de Blois, Jean's husband and nephew of King Philip, was left out. Philip's parliament ruled in favor of Charles de Blois, but John de Montfort fled to avoid arrest. His wife, another strong woman of the time, held out in Hennebont and even led an army to take Redon and secure Rennes. She wrote to Edward for help. Edward was eager to support John de Montfort. He sent Sir Walter Manny to Brittany in April 1342, and later, the Earl of Northampton and Robert d'Artois followed with a larger force. In Hennebont, Lady de Montfort inspired her troops, riding around in armor and leading a sortie to burn the enemy's supplies. When Sir Walter Manny's ships arrived, it gave her the support she needed to continue the fight. By the time Edward landed in Brittany on October 26, 1342, the English had already won several victories. The port of Brest had fallen to the Earl of Northampton, and at Morlakes, Northampton had defeated a larger French force. These victories were celebrated back in England, and Edward's campaign in Brittany was seen as a significant step in his broader plans for France. Edward the King had a big plan. He wanted to take the city of Vannes in Brittany because the French had just captured it and controlled its harbor, which was very important. Vannes wasn't going to be an easy target, though. Edward decided to attack it, from both land and sea. He sent his friend Robert d'Artois with the ships to Brittany, while he led the army on land. Robert d'Artois was brave but unlucky. On his way, he was attacked by Spanish and Genoese ships. He managed to lead an attack on Vannes, but he was overpowered and mortally wounded. A few weeks later, he died. Edward lost a good friend, but Robert had never really lived up to the high expectations Edward had for him as a military leader. Despite the personal loss, this turned out to be a good thing for Edward. The command of his army now fell to English lords, who were very capable. There were several strong commanders with Edward, including the Earls of Derby, Warwick, Huntingdon, Northampton, and Salisbury, and Sir Walter Manny. Allowing these men to use their strengths and ambitions marked a new stage in Edward's leadership. He learned from Robert Bruce in Scotland, who had built a team of loyal and ambitious commanders like Black Douglas and Sir Thomas Randolph. Bruce had used them to win back Scotland from the English. Edward realized he needed to do the same. Edward's new approach worked. The English lords started to win battles. The Earls of Northampton and Warwick destroyed the area around Nantes, and the Earl of Salisbury devastated the area around Dinan. The French and their allies, including Charles de Blois, were on the run. Things were looking good for Edward, but there was a catch. He was far from home, and it was hard to get supplies, especially in the winter. His ships were scattered, and his army was spread out across Brittany. When the main French army approached, it was much bigger than his. Despite this, Edward managed to negotiate a truce that was mostly in his favor. The Treaty of Maelstrom, signed on January 19, 1343, allowed Edward to lift the siege of Vannes, but it also respected the gains and losses in Brittany, released John de Montfort, and kept Flanders free from French control. The truce would last for over 3 years. Edward had a weakness, though. He wasn't as lucky at sea as he was on land. He had survived several dangerous storms, including one in 1326 when he was blown off course, and another in 1340 that almost killed him. In February 1343, he faced another catastrophic storm on his way back from Brittany. Many of his ships were lost, and the fleet was scattered. Edward's ship was hit hard, but he remained calm and fearless, praying to the Virgin Mary and his late father for protection. He was eventually brought to shore at Melcombe Regis in Dorset, and he immediately set off for London. Once there, he went on a series of pilgrimages to thank God and the saints for saving him. He visited St. Paul's Cathedral, his father's tomb at Gloucester, and Walsingham Abbey, and promised to give costly gifts to each place. On April 28, 1343, Edward opened a parliament. There was a lot to discuss. One of the first things they did was to make a rule that representatives couldn't come to Parliament in armor or with weapons. The main topic was the Treaty of Maelstrom. Both houses of Parliament approved it and agreed to support Edward if the peace didn't last. They also agreed to fix wool customs and give the king duty on wool for the next 3 years. This helped Edward get his finances back on track. Edward had some financial issues to deal with, especially with his continental allies. He had borrowed a lot of money from the Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses in Florence. Some people, like Giovanni Villani, said that Edward's refusal to pay these debts caused a major banking crash in Florence. However, recent research suggests that Edward did make some payments, and that the real cause of the crash was more likely internal disputes in Florence. Edward's failure to repay the full amount would have hurt the banks, but it wasn't the only reason they collapsed. One of the most significant financial moves Edward made was to introduce a new gold coin. For a long time, England had only used silver pennies, which were not very useful for international trade. Edward wanted to create a gold coin that would be recognized and used across Europe. The first gold coin, the noble, showed Edward standing on a ship, which symbolized his victory at Sluys and his role as a king who could cross the seas. This coin became a symbol of English power and was widely recognized throughout Europe. Parliament also pushed Edward to limit the power of the Pope. They were concerned that foreigners were being appointed to important positions in the English Church, which meant that the revenues from these positions were going abroad. Edward agreed and passed the Ordinance of Provisors, which prohibited the Pope from appointing clergy to these positions. This was a significant step in limiting the Pope's influence in England, and set the stage for future conflicts between the English crown and the papacy. Edward's leadership was evolving. He was learning to trust and rely on his English commanders, and he was taking steps to strengthen his position both at home and abroad. The treaty and the new gold coin were just the beginning of his efforts to build a strong, respected, and independent England. As the year 1345 dawned, King Edward III of England found himself at a crossroads. The calm and stability of the previous years, marked by tournaments, hunts, and the vibrant life of a medieval court, were about to give way to a new chapter in his reign. Edward, now a seasoned and confident monarch, had to confront the growing tensions with the Pope and the ongoing dispute with France over the throne. In the early months of 1345, Edward was deeply engaged in diplomatic efforts, attempting to resolve the conflict through negotiations. However, the talks with the Pope at Avignon had reached an impasse. Pope Clement VI, who had threatened Edward with excommunication and declared him in rebellion, was biased in favor of Philip VI of France. Despite this, Edward's negotiators, led by the Bishop of Norwich and others, presented a strong and meticulous case for Edward's claim to the French throne. The Pope's attempts to sway them failed, and the negotiations broke down in December 1344. Back in England, Edward's popularity was at an all-time high. He had managed to redeem his last pawned jewels and was financially stable. The people of England, who had been burdened by heavy taxes, were behind their king, supporting his resolve to bring the war to a close on his own terms. Parliament, in turn, had granted a new subsidy, but with a condition. Edward must personally lead an army to France to force Philip to submit. By the spring of 1345, Edward had a detailed plan to launch a three-pronged attack against the French. He divided his forces among himself, the Earl of Derby and the Earl of Northampton. The Earl of Northampton was to lead the assault on Brittany, Derby would target Gascony, and Edward himself would head to Flanders. The goal was to force Philip to split his army, giving the English a strategic advantage with their archers. The Earl of Northampton set sail for Brittany in early June, and Derby followed for Gascony in late July. Edward, however, faced a new challenge when he received news of an armed uprising in Flanders. His ally Van Artevelde was killed by a mob, leaving the Count of Flanders poised to return. Edward saw this as an opportunity to intervene directly. He sailed to Sluys and met with Van Artevelde's supporters, offering the Count of Flanders a chance to swear homage to him as the King of France. When the Count refused, Edward negotiated with the leaders of Bruges, Ypres, and Ghent, securing their support and promising to rid the region of the Count's supporters. However, Edward's plans were once again thwarted by the unpredictable forces of nature. A storm forced his fleet to sail north for 2 days, and the intended secret destination remained a mystery. Recognizing the need to regroup, Edward returned to England. The events of 1345 marked a turning point in Edward's reign. The death of his close friend, the Earl of Salisbury, and the failure of the Round Table tournament at Windsor had sobered him. The loss of Salisbury and the harsh realities of war had stripped away the romantic allure of chivalric tournaments. Edward's focus shifted to the practicalities of warfare and diplomacy. The coming years would see him leading his forces in some of the most significant battles of the 100 Years' War, but the foundation for his strategy had been laid in the tumultuous and transformative year of 1345.